Good morning, or whenever you're looking at this, welcome. I'm Sue McCaffrey, and this is the third of our Odd Week Summer Sunday School lessons on the general theme of do what you have the power to do. This week we're going to talk about a story where Jesus encountered another unnamed person, as most of these encounters are, which Jesus used as a teachable moment. Some people call this the story of the woman whose faith extended the Lord's table. This is a foreign woman who helps to illustrate that Jesus is willing to expand his ministry to all. And she also teaches us something about faith and its power. This story this week comes from both Matthew and Mark. We're going to take a look at the version in Matthew. It's also sometimes called the story of the Canaanite woman or the Syro-Phoenician woman. In Mark, I think she's a Greek woman, but the point is she's a foreigner. She's not Jewish. She's not from Judea. She's a Gentile. So it's also, this story is one of the longest conversations recorded in the Bible between Jesus and a woman. Interestingly, both of the really long conversations between Jesus and a woman are between Jesus and foreign women. And this is one of them. And it's also one of the Bible stories that a lot of people think of as being a sort of a hard story. Because in this story, Jesus, most people think, speaks very harshly, which is sort of uncharacteristic for him. Other people might dare to even say rudely. So it's a tough one, maybe for us to understand. Luke leaves this story out of his gospel entirely. And there are probably a number of people who feel as Luke does, that we should maybe just leave it out. But we're going to look at it anyway. So let's read it. This story comes from Matthew chapter 15, and I'm going to read verses 21 to 28, and I'm reading from the New International Version. So follow along if you'd like to. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs." "Yes, Lord," she said, "but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." Then Jesus answered, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. Okay, so to recap the main events of the story, Jesus has withdrawn to the coast, to Tyre and Sidon, two cities that are on the Mediterranean coast, in modern-day Lebanon, beachfront towns. Just as they were in those days, these cities are very close to the country of the Jews, to Israel or Judea, just over the border. Maybe Jesus and his disciples went down to the beach for a little mini vacation. Don't know. And while he's there in the area of Tyre and Sidon, these two cities, a non-Jewish woman of that region comes up to him and they has this encounter. And in Matthew's gospel, the gospel writer says she's a Canaanite woman. That was an old-fashioned term even then in Matthew's day. Canaan, of course, the promised land before the Israelites came into it. So a very old word for this place. And it sort of conjures up an image of a very old relationship and a sort of troubled relationship between the people of Israel and the people of the land, Canaan. It's a troubled relationship, perhaps in need of restoration, but it's also a close relationship. These people have been bound together in a way since the very beginning. She calls him Lord. The woman calls Jesus Lord. That's how she first approaches him, and Son of David. In Matthew's gospel, the only people who call Jesus Lord are people who believe in Jesus. So this is, a very powerful thing that she uses that term to address him. She begs him to help her daughter who's possessed by a demon. So 3 strikes against this woman. She's a woman, she's a Gentile, and she's the mother of a demoniac, a possessed girl. So an outsider. Jesus' disciples urge him to send her away, and he grants their request initially and tries to get rid of her, apparently, saying some extremely discouraging things to her. But she doesn't go away. And as we're going to see, she's both bold and humble at the same time. Somehow she manages to pull that off. She keeps asking him for what she wants in the face of even his efforts to send her away. And eventually Jesus grants her prayer, grants her request, and acknowledges that she's a woman of great faith. So let's take a look at a couple points in this story. I got interested in these 2 cities of Tyre and Sidon. Went and sort of found them on the maps. They're still called the same thing. They're in Lebanon. And why, the specific region is mentioned. Well, it's very close to the country of Judea, the country of the Jews. Jesus and his disciples didn't have to go very far to get there, down to the seashore. It's sort of the distance I calculated between the city of Sidon, the southernmost city, and the first city you'd bump into in Israel was about 60 miles. So sort of like the distance between Wilmington and Warsaw up in Duplin County. Just as there's a world of difference between Wilmington and Warsaw, at least according to my friend from Warsaw who has immigrated to Wilmington, the difference is not so great that you can't communicate with each other. Jesus and this woman seem to speak the same language. They could communicate, even though there was really something that divided them. In fact, these 2 cities, Tyre and Sidon, have shown up in Scripture before, from way back in the Old Testament. Early in the story of Israel, this is the coastland. This is the area where, and it was a forested region. And this is the region from which the cedars of Lebanon and a lot of pine trees apparently were shipped out of there, harvested and shipped out of there to help build the Jerusalem temple when King Solomon was building his temple originally. In fact, in 1 Kings chapter 5, we learn a lot about the trade relationship between Tyre and Sidon and Israel, a friendly trade relationship, in fact, at the time, between King Solomon of Israel, building the temple, and King Hiram of Tyre, and how Hiram agrees to supply lumber for Solomon's temple. We actually get a letter here, an excerpt from a letter in 1 Kings chapter 5. I'm going to read you a couple lines of this, verses 8 to 11. This is a letter from King Hiram to King Solomon. So Hiram sent word to Solomon, "I have received the message you sent me, and will do all you want in providing the cedar and pine logs. My men will haul them down from Lebanon to the sea, and I will float them in rafts by sea to the place you specify. There I will separate them, and you can take them away. And you are to grant my wish by providing food for my royal household." In this way, Hiram kept Solomon supplied with all the cedar and pine logs he wanted, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, in addition to 20,000 baths of pressed olive oil. Solomon continued to do this for Hiram year after year. That's what we call a successful trade relationship. They had a good trade treaty, these 2. And when you trade with someone that intimately, you sort of know them. They're foreigners, but you have a relationship. So Tyre and Israel have this old symbiotic relationship, goes all the way back to the times of the ancient kingdom. Tyre supplied timber and Israel supplied the food. So my analogy with Warsaw and Duplin County sort of holds up because you get a lot of timber out of Duplin County. Except I think we also get our food from there, so maybe not. Doesn't hold up completely. So besides this old relationship between this coastal forested region and the people of Israel, Jesus himself had just made a reference to Tyre and Sidon in the Gospel of Matthew a couple chapters earlier, shortly before this story takes place. Back in Matthew chapter 11, this is a place where Jesus is teaching something about how his message is being received couple verses from chapter 11 of Matthew, just a couple chapters before what I just read. This is Matthew 11, verse 20 to 22. Then Jesus began to denounce the cities in which most of his miracles had been performed, because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! Those are Jewish cities. If the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. So we have a clue several chapters ahead of this story that Jesus doesn't really look down on Tyre and Sidon entirely. So he may have, had some real reason for going into this region of Canaan. We should probably assume Jesus did not go there by accident. Okay, second thing I want to think about is, what does this woman know when she approaches Jesus for the first time? Apparently, she believes him to be Lord. As we've said, this is no small thing. In Matthew's gospel, if someone calls Jesus Lord, it means that they accept that Jesus is who he said he was. He's the promised one of Israel. He's the one who was to come. He's the Messiah. So that's a loaded term, and even though this woman's not a Jew, she uses that term. That's the very first thing she says to Jesus. She calls him Lord. And in our own day, I just would ask you this. If someone comes up to you and says, I think Jesus is the Lord, I think Jesus is the Messiah, what would we call that person? What's our word for that person? I think it's Christian. Is it fair to call this woman a Christian when she first shows up? When she first addresses Jesus? And she also calls him Son of David. Again, a sort of doubling down on the idea of Lord. It's a term, again, used by Jews who believed he was the promised one. And maybe it had extra special meaning since she was from the region of Tyre and Sidon, with this old relationship between King Solomon and her people, because King Solomon was literally the son of David. So she, this Canaanite woman, trusts that this is the man who can grant her heart's true desire, which is to relieve the terrible suffering of her daughter. So she makes bold to go up and speak to him. And if it's right to think of this woman as a sort of an intuitive follower of Jesus from the very moment that she first appears in the story, we could have a few more questions here. How does that happen? How does the word spread to a person like that? How do people recognize its truth? You can think about that. Third thing I want to think about is Jesus's response to this woman. And this is the hardest part of the story. And interpreting this part can get you in trouble. I know people that it has gotten in trouble. It's hard enough, as we said, that only 2 of the Gospels even mention it. What do we make of this response that Jesus gives? When this woman offers her first prayer to Jesus, she got no answer at all. It says Jesus did not answer a word. So silence. Then his disciples urged him to send her away, because her repeated petitions were apparently annoying them, and they were on this beach vacation after all. So Jesus appears to grant them their wish. He states to her, he was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel. So not her. This lost sheep of Israel reference is a loaded one. It's a very tender phrase that we heard also from that prophet of doom, Jeremiah, in chapter 50, when he describes the people of Israel and Judah as having been led astray by their own shepherds. And Jesus here is making a point that it's his mission and his assignment to be the good shepherd of Israel and Judah, who will restore the kingdom of God for the people of God. But in fact, this is not the first time, even in Matthew's gospel, that Jesus has healed a foreign person who's not one of the children of Israel. Just a little bit earlier, he had healed the servant of a centurion. That is a Roman officer. He performed a healing miracle for another person who was not Jewish. And in Matthew 8, verse 10, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith, when he speaks about this centurion. But Jesus' power to rebuff this woman when he tells her that he's not interested in her because he's only come to the children of Israel, it doesn't work because she doesn't go away, and she comes back a second time with a second prayer. This time the prayer is simply, Lord, help me. Now Jesus says something most people interpret as insulting. He says, it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs. And many commentators on this story point out that the Jews were not pet lovers. They didn't have dogs in their houses. Dogs were those sort of scruffy, filthy, beggar animals hanging around out in the streets. So to refer to them was not to refer to anybody very noble, these stray dogs. And you would think that this blunt and unwelcoming reply would be pretty discouraging, do the trick, get the woman to go away. People want to ask, was he testing her? Was he considering changing his mind about something? Was his mission from God changing right there in that moment? These are all possible interpretations. We can speculate. We don't know. That's how the Bible works. You'll have to come back and read the story again later. But here's what I want to think about finally. Why did she persist after this initial rejection? What gave her the power to come back a third time? And why did she use that power? Now, if many people think that Jesus' comment to this woman about dogs was very harsh, others might think that her response to what Jesus said was sort of sassy too. And I admit that I think of these two, Jesus and this Canaanite woman, as having a fairly witty conversation that was rough in tone only if you don't think of them as people who liked and trusted each other. If they were people who did trust each other, they're having a repartee. To Jesus' comment about dogs, she comes back with her own observation about dogs. And in this case, maybe nice, well-behaved house pets will sit patiently under the table and wait for crumbs. Maybe that was her experience of dogs. And her response is a brilliant combination, I think, of humility and boldness. She doesn't make any claim to be equal to the lost sheep of Israel. In fact, she seems to accept a subordinate status. She's not claiming to be one of the children, but she reminds the Lord that he also feeds dogs, and she'll take whatever he would give them. And Jesus rewards this third, bold, humble, confident prayer by giving her what she dearly wants, which is healing for her daughter. And he exclaims that she has great faith. What does that faith consist of? What does Jesus mean you have great faith? Here's what I think about this. She seemed to be very confident that her prayer was good and acceptable to the Lord. That healing for her daughter was what he wanted too. She wasn't asking him for anything he didn't want. She was also very confident that this son of David had the power to make this good thing happen, and she was not going to stop asking for it as long as it took. And that's what she had the power to do. So think it over, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Be healthy.